Today's podcast is brought to you by Ryan, a leading global tax service and software provider that helps companies manage and minimize property taxes from acquisition to disposition and all points in between. As the firm with the most local market property tax professionals across the country, Ryan has experience in nearly every jurisdiction, unmatched by any other national, regional, or local provider.
Welcome to WMRE's Common Area Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the award-winning editorial staff at WMRE. Let's jump right into this week's podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Common Area with your host, David Bodamer. David, how are you?
I am well. I'm here it's a rainy day currently. At the moment that we're recording, it's currently raining in Brooklyn, so it's a little gray and rainy right now. But overall, things are all right. How are things in your part of the world?
Hey, April showers, May flowers, whatever they say, right? I mean that's good stuff. I like rain actually, so yeah, it's good. It's a good time of year, and it's even better today because you have a guest on the show, right?
That's correct. For this week's episode, I'm happy to bring in Bill Hill, who is the vice chairman of the Federal Investor Services Group with Newmark. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi, David. Eric, great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on the program. One of the things that I thought, probably the best place to start is if you could just tell us a bit about the Federal Investor Services Group with Newmark, your role with the company, your background, and just kind of give us a little lay of the land for what that means.
Sure. Definitely explain what I do. It's a niche practice within commercial real estate. We're a growing team here at Newmark, and we advise and partner with institutions, investors, owners, and developers across the nations. David, our clients are looking to usually lease to or retain the federal government in their properties. But we also help our clients acquire and sell assets that are leased to the government. As you can imagine, mining through not only the politics of the government, but also being skilled in the nuances of the federal government procurement process. Mm-hmm. It helps us differentiate ourselves from some of our private sector brethren, but also helps to guide our clients in and out of difficult federal leasing and sales transactions. So simply put, we help our clients, again, lease to or retain the federal government or acquire or dispose of assets with federal government tenancy.
And this is this is not new for you. You've been doing this for a while, but you are new to Newmark. Is that correct?
I'm 2 months into Newmark. In those 2 months, been able to meet a lot of our colleagues across the platform. And, we've made a good amount of progress in just 2 months. Not much sleep, but I can sleep later.
So, yeah, I guess just to start with some of that, this is something that, in my career, we've written about from time to time, but not very often. And you are the first person that we brought on the podcast who specializes in this. So there's a lot that I think would be interesting for the audience to hear. And, one of those pieces, I guess, is like that complexity of working with government as a tenant, government who has their own processes. How is that different from, doing like a standard kind of office lease?
Yeah, sure. I guess first, Dave, let's frame what we're talking about, the footprint here. GSA is in 11 regions across the nation. They're sitting currently in a tad bit under 8,000 leases, but we're talking about 2,000 communities that goes well beyond where I sit here in D.C. But the total, we're just looking at GSA. 185, a tad bit under. Some of the census leases are rolling off. 185 million square feet of space, and this is again privately owned. The private lease inventory. What I'm not including here, are many DoD leases, veterans VA leases, as well as a few other federal leases of agencies with independent leasing authority. So we're talking just a wide swath of what folks typically look at or consider when they're thinking about the lease inventory in the nation, the federal government.
Right.
And we think about, the federally owned buildings. There's a great deal of those too, but we're just tackling here, addressing the private owned portion of that. Now, to your question about the process and what makes it different, government has a procurement process. So before you can even get to the lease, or even when you have a lease in your building, before you can renew that lease, you have to go through a government procurement process. So there's certain government etiquette you follow. There's a way to coordinate the interaction with the government as well as to respond to it. But what we do, we act as a translator of sort for our client to make sure that their fiduciary interests are maintained, but also accurately represented in that procurement. Again, conveyed to the government in a way that's acceptable to the government and checks all of their boxes.
And yeah, and I think, it's important that you kind of give us the overall lay of the land there, because I think like the natural response to think of, federal government is like, you're talking about DC, but you're not talking about DC. Right. You're talking about the entire country. You're talking about regional EPA offices or NOAA offices, or, the whole alphabet soup of agencies that just might be taking either a building or a floor or whatever. And this is all over the country.
You hit it right on the head there. I mean, there's also a lot of satellite offices, or all the small USDA offices, or, in the census years, you balloon up, the lease inventory balloons up from all those census leases. We're talking about all of that. I mean, DC contributes a great amount of the federal inventory, but the leasing inventory, but we're talking about a quarter of the nation's inventory versus more than that. I mean, it talks between 25 to 30% of that, but almost 70% of that by default is outside of the DC area. So there are different regions where there are more leases than others, but there's a healthy amount all around the country.
And so throughout the pandemic, having government as a tenant, how has that been? Has there been real differences to having them as a tenant versus like another kind of occupier?
Yes, I mean, therein lies the value of not just government credit, but government tenancy. These GSA leases, they're not subject to force majeure. So, as long as, our clients, the investor ownership community kept the buildings open, they received rent. You can imagine, I just told you that the numbers, the scale of the government leases. If you had a hole in the nation of those leases, either vacating or not paying rent to the private sector, what that would have done to our economy. But the government was able to withhold or maintain those leasehold interests and their obligations to pay rent therein, and that was a huge lift to the economy during that period of COVID unrest.
And was there any difference in the way that they were like work from home versus in person? Was that any different, or was it didn't matter? They were just paying their rents, whether or not they were literally sending people back or not.
Right. I mean, again, you have to frame this under the concept of how the government was already working from home or teleworking. I say GSA a lot and government interchangeably. GSA is, by all intents and purposes, the asset and property management to the government, right? But GSA was leading the charge there. They were working from home or teleworking at a higher clip than a lot of other agencies. The government still had a pretty, I'd say, advanced teleworking practice or policies within different agencies, but that depended on the mission of that agency, the criticality of the level of security, what folks were working on, if those were protected, top secret, et cetera. That depended on how those agencies work from home. Even in the midst of, or during the peaks of COVID throughout 2020 and currently, there were some agencies that were still going to work as they were, just because their missions depended on them being in their seats. So I think that's changed, or I know that's changed a bit. Eventually, kind of what we're talking about here, where we're going. Some of these work sites that haven't been open as they were previously, they will need to reopen. The government's working now to understand how they'll repatriate these offices and re-enter the offices, just as the private sector is. I think the private and public sector will need to factor in considering, a little bit more flexibility when it comes to remote work going forward. But the thought that the government's going to eventually be completely work from home is just like the private sector. I think that's far from reality.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're already seeing a bunch of companies who even said a few months ago that we don't know when we're coming back, or we're not going to come back until later in the year, or maybe early next year, and now suddenly are saying in a few months. And I can only imagine on the government side it's going to be the same, if not more accelerated. Because of the nature, like you're talking about, the security, the nature of the jobs, and the nature of the agencies. It just doesn't seem like we're going to have it seems strange in theory to think about having a work from home government.
Well, here's the thing too, and we can talk a little bit about some of the Biden's initiatives and some of the agencies in favor, and where the activity might lie. Look at our crystal ball here, David. But as these agencies' missions grow, or really as they evolve with this administration's initiatives, so will their real estate needs. Those will also need to change. So growing in some cases, contracting in others. But the question now is, how will that look in the short term from us, as commercial real estate professionals? We believe this will be a hybrid solution. And we're encouraged by the fact that there will be activity. Part of what we do is find solutions as we mine through these trends or different places the market is below and above equilibrium. But activity, we don't like a stagnant market. we love activity. But again, we think the most likely solution is some hybrid solution, but you also need to layer in those variables of such as the agency or the user groups that you're reopening, how they reopen, and what their missions are.
Yeah. So you just alluded to what was going to be my next question, which is, okay, so now we have a different government than we had a year ago. We have Democrats in control of the presidency in both houses of Congress. We have a pretty audacious, ambitious jobs plan that Congress is looking at. What kind of implication for a sort of two-part question? One, does Democratic or even just unified control in and of itself have any implications for real estate? And then secondly, does this potential jobs plan have implications for what we could see in terms of demand going forward from like the federal government for real estate?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's really two parts in how I analyze that. From Democrat versus Republican. I always say in this DC area, we're in the sport of politics, and I mean the best lens to look at this is through a purple one, not a red or a blue. But when you spoke to alignment, and when you have full alignment of Congress as well as the presidency, no matter who's been in the office, red or blue, charting back to Great Depression, post Great Depression, you've had an average growth of a little bit higher than 10% average when you have full alignment, and that's federal budget growth, which leads to leasing activity. Again, talking about how the agencies, as they evolve, as they grow, they need more space. So that's what the numbers say. Looking here now at the Biden administration priorities, and there's 7. The first is COVID, obviously, and the response to that, I think everyone can agree. I think we're tracking, we're progressing admirably. People sit on different sides of that, but COVID. Second is climate. racial equity. And again, it's not just, on paper, kumbaya, we shall overcome. That's important too. But we're talking about criminal justice reform, healthcare access, fair housing, small business. There's another one. Restoring tribal sovereignty, which I think is probably one of the most interesting, intriguing stories we have here with Secretary of the Interior, the first indigenous Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. I mean, if that doesn't become a Netflix special, I don't know what will in this administration. But so that's racial equity. Then you move down to the fourth, economy. That you talked about, the infrastructure bill and things of that nature. Healthcare, immigration, and the last is restoring America's standing globally. Mm-hmm. So, those are initiatives. I mean, part of what we do to the mining of the politics and the process and how that, making our clients a little bit more or better in how they view the government, how they move, is what does that mean from an agency standpoint? So, I mean, you look at, we talked about, HHS, for instance. I mean, their mission is ever changing. And if we had an MVP agency, this might be it. Xavier Becerra is, and I'm talking about some of the appointees. Some of these folks haven't been confirmed, but we're looking at, these agencies in favor or the ones to watch and monitor. And that's one I mentioned. Secretary Haaland and her charge. It's not just, the interiors is they have a multifaceted role, not just our parks, but also they tie into some of our climate initiatives or the climate initiatives that America has undertaken, as well as Michael Reagan from the EPA. So, I mean, these folks are tasked with not only charting their agency, but also how they coalesce with the priorities and from how we look at this, what that means for future activity in that agency. Immigration is kind of one of the big tickets that our last administration ran under, and going forward, it's including these first couple of months, it's not going to leave the news. The first Hispanic secretary there, Alejandro Mayorkas. How does CBP change? How does citizenship and immigration services? There are a lot of CIS offices around the nation that are more welcoming. What does that do to the footprint of that agency? That's, when I watch the news, and I have to be guarded of how much news I'm watching these days, but when I'm watching the news, that's what I'm listening for. And then, from the policy to real estate, it's usually, at least 18 months before we see some movement there, how these policies really turn into, how they translate to the government's needs analysis and their needs assessment, what space they really need.
That's really interesting. So you look now and you follow stuff now and you follow what they're saying now, but like the timeline is like 18 months for when the implications may actually hit on the
yeah, exactly. And we're talking about the government here too.
Yeah,
so
right, of course. So
the beauty of
very
the
fast.
Exactly, which also is kind of the beauty of it for the American economy. I mean, can you imagine if the government weren't the Titanic and some small sailboat, and they were able to just drop on a dime, make these quick decisions? I mean, for the good and the bad, I think that really affects us and swings a little bit more than we need our government to react. Even looking at how that last objective, restoring America's global standing, I look at intelligence and State Department is kind of being in that area there, and what are they going to do? We saw, the intelligence community. I'm not sure if they really shrunk on paper, but at least in figure and in concept under the last administration, how the intelligence community was viewed. Again, my job isn't to say whether right or wrong, just to look at where we are and how that tracks. But I definitely think now they'll be more in favor. And by the initiative, you think that Avril Haines and Anthony Blinken, Intelligence and State, they're going to have the work cut out to minus our charge there. Again, I try not to look at the news too much. There was I get these notifications like I'm sure you two do all the time. I got a notification not too long before this started about what was it, Microsoft? I'm drawing a blank on the other company, but just suffered another hack. And DOD was saying that, my words, not theirs, that it was somewhat of an innocuous hack. I think about one of the more funded agencies going into this. I mean, they're technically a part of DHS, but they have a bit of independence. CISA, which is cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. CISA will. This is me personal. I think that our current war is being fought through cyber. I mean, we have a lot of our trusted and at least from me, greatly respected and admired soldiers over in different parts of the world. But just as there are folks who are fighting for us sitting in these offices, because I think one of the biggest threats right now is through our cybersecurity.
I did think it was interesting, though, one point you mentioned as sort of an overall backdrop to this, which was that looking through time, that when the government is under control, when the government is under control by the same party, that overall that space tends to increase, and that's not one part or the other. It's just having united control leads to or has historically led to expansion of real estate. That's a pretty interesting finding.
Yeah. I mean, expansion of the government. So you have anything that spurs economic activity. I mean, one of the biggest stimulants therein has been full alignment, of the White House and Congress.
Yeah, because the stereotype would be that Republicans want smaller government and Democrats want bigger government, so it would fluctuate like that. But it doesn't. It sounds like it doesn't fluctuate like that. It sort of more fluctuates on having unified control one way or the other. And if you have the three parties in control, I guess that sometimes that's what leads to more of a stimulative effect here.
I think what we've seen is that Republicans and Democrats want their own types of government. They want the government to be shaped and viewed in the way that they look at it. I mean, again, taking the politics out of it, looking at the human nature, that's what we all want. So, and that, if you look at the stats track closer to that than there being a partisan view over the size of the government. And again, we're looking over a long period of time, so it's hard to refute the evidence there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though. It's like what you said, investing in the different priorities. So therefore, that would make a lot of sense, because if something may have been not getting attention, a certain agency or a new set of priorities which may require new types of hiring or new types of policies, that's what can provide some stimulus to these real estate, to eventually eventually trickling into real estate needs. And so interesting.
Another key component of that, David, is we jumped to the work from home and kind of where we are today. But before March of 2020, and really for almost 9 years prior to that, GSA had been focused on increasing space utilization, throughout the federal government. And 6 years before that, really 6 years ago from today, 2015 is where the freeze the footprint became the rallying point and the main goal of the government and the agency. So, so even before COVID hit, GSA was a good way through its reprogramming, or some folks in our business say the densification of its portfolio. Mm-hmm. As were some segments of the private sector. I mean, the law firm groups and the like, they had their own increased utilization movement, putting more bodies in less space. So that's an important trend to really look at. That's what the real estate community, that's where we're moving toward. So we were in this, more densely mode of occupying space, and we're now in an area where I don't know if I'm that comfortable, in this COVID environment and being so close to you. I mean, I like you, buddy, and you're good company here, but I'm not sure if I want to be that close to you. That's where we are. I want to make sure we frame the conversation around. There are two opposing streams of thought here and how, again, the world, but we're talking GSA, will occupy space. And, to GSA's credit, they do have some very, very thinking about this and working on their new workplace strategy and updating that document to better inform the policy on how their employees should and will repatriate the space.
I'm saying I was never a big fan of the densification. So
you and me both.
I don't mind. I understand some of the appeal to like open office and layouts and environments and for certain teams, but I think like we kind of like made it too much of a one size fits all approach. And I don't know, I think if we come out of this with a little bit more flexibility and creativity and hybrid work models, I think that could maybe harder to manage that from like a, on a constant basis. But I think from a work perspective, I think it would be better.
Yeah. I mean, the open plan, it's something that we'll have to look at that all together. I mean, funny little side note, my wife was talking and we were, I don't know what month we were in, month 2 or month 7 of kind of the COVID world, and
March 707.
Exactly. We looked at each other and she said, "This open plan concept, if we had more demising walls here and we could lock the kids off in their own section, we might be a little happier." So I think everyone, for a lot of different reasons, looking at this open plan concept a lot stiffer eye.
Yeah. We miss doors. Doors are nice.
Oh man, doors were so nice, weren't they? that barn door I have just isn't cutting it right now.
So one last point. So it's just taking all of this and okay. So like if you're a real investor looking, I'm interested in real, this is interesting. Government as a tenant sounds interesting. There's some pluses here. Is there a way to like, as an investor, to approach this space to get in and try to invest in having a portfolio that has some balance or strength with government tenants in it?
Yeah, I swear we didn't plan this, but that's a really good softball, man. I'm a Detroit Tigers fan. I mean, first thing is call him Bill Hill, but seriously, a couple ways to approach it depending on your asset. I mean, one of the first things we look at is the building and would it accommodate the government? I say the government, this isn't a one size fits all. It's many, many different governments and the agencies are different. So, which agencies would be a great fit for that asset. But, again, there's a procurement process and, there's a way to respond, but also a way to be a bit more proactive and look at what's coming down the pipe and going after those deals for your assets.
So it's basically fitting into to call you. Essentially, this is the answer.
I don't know, make it up. You leave my number on the podcast. Yep. Well, as they drive down now that the William Hill sports bet is in DC and very prominent. I get a lot of texts and pictures. It used to be it was only UK. Friends and family were across the pond. They'll send me the pictures or bring the Polaroids back. But now I get those all the time. So maybe that'll help with the messaging. You see William Hill there, you call me for your federal real estate needs.
So was there any other points or things that I didn't ask about that you think would be good for the listeners to understand about this space?
I think really just how we look at our current environment, our current world, David, it is a challenge. And to a lot of owners of federal real estate or folks, owners of real estate in general, I think our challenge right now is the future opportunity in our space. As the government and really as tenants re-examine how they want to re-examine what their workforce needs are and will be, being a group that can help them with that quagmire, help them to solve how they're going to use their space or to get them comfortable with maybe a slight reprogramming of how they're using their space, or for our clients, how we can better assist the government with how it's looking at the space that they're in. I think there's always an opportunity when you can help, folks solve hard problems. And we've seen this COVID environment. It's not been an easy environment in any stretch of the imagination.
You've been generous with your time, so I appreciate you coming on and walking me through some of this stuff and explaining how it all works.
David, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed talking. I mean, again, I know the federal leasing world is isn't we aren't talking about this isn't an ESPN around the horn, but I really enjoyed speaking with you. And again, any other follow-up questions? I'm sure you're now all federal leasing experts, but any other questions? I'm happy to talk about this. This is what I talk about all day, every day. You can ask my wife.
And folks, if you can find you, I mean, well, there's the Newmark website. Are there other good ways for folks to find you?
William.hill@nmrk.com. That's my email. But the website is a great start. Email is the second.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, this was a fantastic podcast. Always great information, David. Bill, I'm so glad that you joined the show. This was very, very interesting, something that we have not talked about on the podcast before, as far as I remember, David. Yeah, so this is fantastic. David, of course, thank you for bringing him on the show. It was a great conversation. And our last thank you always goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Common Area Podcast with David Bodamer. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when David comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your colleagues. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at WMRE, this is Eric Johnson inviting you back in 2 weeks for all the stories that matter to you. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Common Area Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WMRE or Informa. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Ryan, liberating our clients from the burden of being overtaxed, freeing their capital to invest, grow, and thrive.